We are happy to have here with us the President of the United States.
Facing an escalating crisis, President Trump chose Rush Limbaugh's call-in show to defend killing Soleimani.
He's a terrorist. He was designated a terrorist by President Obama, and then Obama did nothing about it.
But outside of that, few answers from the White House on deeply puzzling questions. If the killing of Soleimani was designed to deter further attacks, has the Trump administration in fact provoked them?
It's that tension between Trump, who wants to be the tough guy, who wants to have these dramatic steps, who wants to undo everything that President Obama did, and the Trump who doesn't want to go to war. That clash has just played out. This round has gone to the Trump who's prepared to go to war if it means distinguishing himself from his predecessor.
Consequences could include attacks by Iran's proxy militias on U.S. military assets or on civilians even outside the Middle East. The U.S. Secretaries of State and Defense will brief senators and representatives in a closed-door session on Wednesday, but that hasn't squelched Democrat demands to explain the risk calculation.
Iran has many dangerous surrogates in the region and a whole range of possible responses. What do we know about what Iran would plan to do in retaliation?
I truly believe that President Trump does not want to enter a war with Iran.
Douglas Silman was the U.S. ambassador to Iraq till last year and says other countries must step in with diplomacy to help the U.S. avoid a dangerous war footing.
But I think it's going to have to be led, at least in the short term, by countries other than the United States. And as I said a couple of times, Canada is very well placed to be a calm, wise figure.
But there is little sense of calm tonight, with more U.S. forces deploying and other troops inside the region being moved to prepare and defend.
And so speaking of troops, Susan, Iraq's parliament this weekend voted to force U.S. forces out of the country. There was a letter today, a strange letter today, suggesting that might happen.
Yeah, for a few hours, a lot of confusion. This letter from the U.S. military to Iraqi officials saying, we respect your sovereign decision to force us out, until the U.S. Defense Secretary had to come out and say, no, this was a mistake. It was premature, it was unsigned, it should never have happened. A lot of people saying, wow, a chaotic response to such a volatile situation. And in fact, U.S. troops are not leaving Iraq at all. And in fact, more B-52 bombers are being sent to an airbase close to Iran tonight, just in case.
Just in case. All right, Susan, thanks very much.
Okay.
As you heard, there are still a lot of questions about how the Trump administration made the decision and the message it wants to send. So we took those questions to Morgan Ortega of the U.S. State Department.
So you were on the record last week as saying that the strategy, characterized by some as strategic patience, was working very well. And if that was the case, why change it?
We told the Iranian regime very publicly and privately, but especially publicly, not to confuse our restraint and the patience that we had shown towards the regime for weakness. That if you target and injure, kill, harm American citizens anywhere in the world, that we would hold the regime accountable.
What
very
changed
publicly.
from last week to now?
An American was killed, and American service members were injured, an American embassy was attacked. And we had credible intelligence that more of that going in overdrive was going to happen, and that was untenable.
So your perception is that the world is safer now. It's an interesting thing to say, because if you look at the last 72 hours, last week, weeks previous, there were big protests in Iran against the regime. Those effectively have fallen away. The Iraqis are suggesting the Americans need to leave. Iran has pulled out of its enrichment commitments. How is any of that safer? How is any of that a win?
When you're dealing with a terrorist regime, when you talk about, it's hard to talk about winning. You have to make calculated decisions for what is in the best interest of the American people. You had a situation, by the way, where it wasn't just the attacks we've seen in the past weeks. We could look at the past 2 decades of Qasem Soleimani being ahead of the IRGC.
So why
we can
now,
see 40 years.
Why now?
It's never based off one thing. We try, when we're having these conversations in the media, to try and point to one singular piece of intelligence. It doesn't work that way.
Canada's leading the NATO mission in Iraq.
Yes.
There are hundreds of Canadian troops there. What did
Great
Canada
partners.
know about this before it happened?
I can't answer that specifically. I would have to talk to the Secretary to see what consultations that he had. We have been working incredibly closely with Canada, with our European allies, with everyone at NATO since the decision to take out Qasem Soleimani.
What is the ask of Canada now? as an ally?
Well, Canada, as you pointed out, has been incredibly crucial in the de-ISIS campaign. And so in Iraq, we have seen the territorial defeat of the caliphate, but that fight remains ongoing.
And if the fight against ISIS is ended there because of this strike, how does that help?
Yeah, well, we don't see that happening.
You don't?
No.
So as you just heard, U.S. officials contacted the Canadian government after the killing of Soleimani. Today, Canada's Minister of Defence was asked about it on CBC News Network's Power and Politics.
We had an indication of something was going to happen. We did not know what was going to happen. We have taken the appropriate steps for force protection for where our personnel are. We have made decisions to move personnel to certain different locations, and also non-essential people to be able to move them outside Iraq.
So Harjit Sajjan also said there is currently no discussion of pulling out of Iraq, and that Canada wants both the NATO mission and the U.S.-led coalition mission in the country to continue. Now, Donald Trump has threatened to answer any Iranian retaliation with a fast, hard, and possibly disproportionate response. That's not, in fact, unusual from this president. But Trump's tweet on Saturday raised some eyebrows, vowing to target 52 Iranian sites, some important to Iranian culture. The U.S. Secretary of State at first walked it back.
President Trump didn't say he'd go after a cultural site. Read what he said.
And then Trump made it clear to reporters on Air Force One, quote, "We're not allowed to touch their cultural site. It doesn't work that way." But in fact, it does work that way. Targeting cultural sites is forbidden by international law, including a 2017 UN resolution adopted by the Trump administration.
To protect cultural heritage as a symbol of understanding and respect for all religions, beliefs, and civilizations.
The aim to deter the kind of destruction ISIS visited on ancient sites in Syria and Iraq. Now, it's action the White House seems to defend, at least in some circumstances.
It may happen if Iran retaliates in a certain way.
But that would still violate international law if they are cultural sites.
I'm telling you.
But does the president...
Allies seem to be hoping this is all just bluster.
We've been very clear that cultural sites are protected under international law, and we'd expect that to be respected.
Trump's State Department at least says the U.S. will play by the rules.
We will do everything within the law to keep Americans safe.
That doesn't sound like a hard question to answer. It would be a
We'll do
war
everything
crime.
within the law
It would
to
be a
keep
war
Americans
crime.
safe. We'll do everything within the law to keep Americans safe.